Our next session begins with a discussion on disinformation, coercion and control. This session will begin with a short set of framing remarks from Věra Jourová, the Vice President of Values and Transparency at the European Commission. We'll then go into a panel discussion led by Renée DiResta, the Technical Research Manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. The panellists for this session include Baiba, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, Herming, the Deputy Minister of Digital Affairs for Taiwan, Mihoko Matsubara, the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation, and Lara, the Head of Capacity Building Practice at Protection Group International. Please join me in welcoming all of our guests.
Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for this opportunity to participate in the annual Sydney Dialogue by means of this video message. I will briefly present to you how we see the topic of foreign interference and disinformation from a European perspective. Starting with foreign interference. This is a phenomenon which we all increasingly face, with hostile campaigns driven by foreign information manipulation and interference, as well as disinformation. Foreign state actors are using manipulative tactics, techniques, and procedures to undermine our freedoms, our democracy, and our universal values by employing bots, using artificial amplification, creating fake websites, and suppressing independent and critical voices. We have seen this especially in the context of Russia's ongoing military aggression against Ukraine, and we saw it before during the pandemic. Topics such as food and energy security, as well as public health and others, are manipulated to distort public discourse and sow fear and confusion in societies all over the world. The European Union has taken unprecedented steps to respond to Russia's coordinated and strategic use of such manipulation to undermine Ukraine. We have sanctioned key outlets of Russia's war propaganda, such as Russia Today and Sputnik, demonstrating the EU's willingness and capability to act across various domains while working with key partners. In its contribution to the United Nations Global Digital Compact, the EU has highlighted the importance of maintaining a free, open, accessible and non-fragmented internet, and the importance of fighting information manipulation and interference. The EU considers foreign information manipulation and interference, including disinformation, as one among key security issues, also in the Indo-Pacific region. International cooperation is essential to counter these activities, and it is more crucial than ever. We are determined to work even closer with international partners around the globe who have the same resolve as us to respond to information manipulation and interference while fully respecting fundamental rights and freedoms. For action within its borders, the Commission is preparing a Defense of Democracy package for adoption in the second quarter of this year. The Defense of Democracy package will deepen the action under the European Democracy Action Plan to promote free and fair elections, to step up the fight against disinformation, and to support media freedom and pluralism. This will include developing civic space and citizen participation to bolster democratic resilience from within. It will include proposals to protect our democracies and strengthen trust by defending our democratic system from outside interests. The package will include the following main elements: a legislative proposal including harmonized measures for interest representation for third countries to protect the EU democratic sphere from covert foreign interference. And a review of actions under the European Democracy Action Plan, which are measures on inclusive democratic participation, civic engagement, and secure and resilient elections, including cybersecurity measures in electoral processes, in a set of recommendations. The package will ensure the proportionality of any possible restrictions to the fundamental rights and democratic values, including freedom of expression and association, and prevent any potential misuse. We are aware of Australian efforts to deal with the same challenges. When it comes to disinformation, the EU has in recent years put together a robust framework for coordinated action that is fully in line with European values and fundamental rights, in particular freedom of expression. Our strategy aims to make the online environment more transparent and its actors accountable, to empower citizens, and to foster open democratic debate. The strengthened 2022 Code of Practice on Disinformation, delivered last year in June, is a centerpiece of the EU's efforts. It builds on the experience gained through the 2018 Code of Practice and takes into account lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The new code contains a range of commitments from major online platforms and other players to fight disinformation decisively in various areas, such as demonetization, addressing manipulative behaviors, user empowerment, and fact-checking. A substantial number and great variety of new signatories, and we have 38 to date, have signed the code, including the major online platforms such as Google, Meta, Microsoft, Twitter, and TikTok. The Commission is carefully assessing the signatories' reports. It is the first time that platforms are sharing detailed data, and at member state level, on their measures to fight disinformation. This effort is similar with what Australia is aiming to achieve with its own Code of Practice on Disinformation and Misinformation, and the challenges we are facing are exactly the same. The EU has been exchanging best practices with the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which will be granted new powers this year to combat harmful online misinformation and disinformation. And we have been addressing these matters also through binding legislation. The EU's Digital Services Act recognizes the positive role of cross-border user-generated information. It ensures transparency and accountability of the online space, and it bans all 27 EU governments from imposing general monitoring obligations. The Digital Services Act takes an asymmetric approach to ensure that very large online platforms of at least 45 million EU users, which have become public spaces of expression, are open and fair. This includes equipping citizens to understand and interact with the information they see online and giving them rights where currently they are at the discretion of private actors, in particular large online platforms. The Digital Services Act is accompanied by co-regulatory measures such as Code of Conduct, standards, and crisis protocols, which aim at building good practices and fostering cross-industry cooperation. The Commission will have exclusive competence for the designation of very large online platforms and the enforcement of systemic obligations against them. On its end, the Digital Markets Act includes rules to restore market contestability and tackles practices that have proven harmful by large online platforms that hold a gatekeeping position in the market. From a global perspective, the Digital Markets Act is a first of its kind, and it aims to inspire other jurisdictions in their regulation of digital markets. To this end, we have taken concrete initiatives to cooperate on achieving the aims of the Digital Markets Act, which will help boost innovation and competitiveness in Europe and beyond. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us continue to face these challenges together. Many thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel. My name is Renée DiResta, and I'm the Technical Research Manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. I must admit, as an American, I saw the title Disinformation, Coercion, and Control, and I thought, oh my goodness, those are quite the words to put together. In the US right now, we're currently in the midst of some vitriol, actually, around even the most the definitions of what is disinformation. How do we ensure that in that quest to preserve free expression, we don't wind up in a situation where the cure is worse than the disease. This is compounded a bit by partisan tension, but I think it is a real core concern that we're going to interrogate in our panel today, the question of what is the problem, how do we see the problem. We have distinguished panelists from several different countries, some from the private sector, some from government, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to start by doing a quick round of introductions and then dive right in.
My name is Baiba Braže. I'm Assistant Secretary General at NATO, responsible for public diplomacy, which means both coordinating NATO strategic communications across civil military authorities, but also indeed being part of the work that we do to place this hostile information campaign, disinformation, in the part of responses to the threats that we see to the allied populations and countries.
Hi, my name is Herming Chiueh. I'm a Deputy Minister of Digital Affairs in Taiwan. So we are a very new ministry, only 7 months. Currently, we are taking in charge of the digital governance and also the cybersecurity issue in Taiwan.
Hello, my name is Mihoko Matsubara. I'm Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation, a Tokyo-based global ICT service provider. My background is Japanese Ministry of Defense, and my role is to raise cybersecurity awareness in the world.
Hello, good morning. My name is Lara, and I head up the capacity building practice at Protection Group International. My background is cybersecurity. I've been helping nations build digital resilience for just under 15 years. Previously to my time at PGI, I was the Director of Strategy at the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center. I'm a co-author of the Capacity Maturity Model for Nations. Thank you.
I think that focus on resilience is really important to explore in this panel as well. Lilba, I'd love to start with you. A little bit of visibility into how NATO in particular is thinking about disinformation at the moment. Maybe perhaps describe the threat for us and how you've seen it evolve.
Thank you very much. And first, a big thank you to the Australian government for supporting this forum and to ASPI for putting it together. Here we see what exactly the response should be to any challenges or threats which we are facing. It has to be the governments, it has to be the private sector, the civil society, academia, and let's say the whole society approach. As for NATO, quite clearly, we are not admiring the problem. I mean, disinformation is not new, hostile information is not new. It has always been there since at least NATO's establishment in 1949. But what we are seeing currently, of course, is the fact that really the information environment, information space is only one. There is no borders in it. So there is no borders to the threats, respectively. Kinetic threats, it's a different sort of visibilities that we can see and understand. But these hybrid threats, these non-conventional threats, obviously can affect everybody and everyone everywhere. So for NATO, the crucial part is to look at the intent and to try to understand. So we define it through the hostile information attacks and activities. Disinformation we also look at, because disinformation also contains a malign intent, but we are less concerned with misinformation, which can be inadvertent spread of untrue information. But again, for NATO, that is less of a concern. So when we look at the hostile information campaigns, they usually are part of a variety of other tools and methods with the aim to undermine either an organization or a country or achieve a particular aim of manipulating certain processes in a country, whether electoral processes, whether certain legislation processes or others. And in that respect, obviously, the understanding the problem is needed, but admiring the problem is not enough. So what we do about it is quite clearly, within NATO, we have invested quite a lot of resources in defining the approach, which is understand, engage, and cooperate. Understand, meaning understanding the information environment. So that is also investment in the most advanced tech, but also the teams, the training, the networks, the processes, repeatable processes, data that can be shared. And that is actually part of the problem, that we don't have these reliable data sets that can be shared with other partners, whether in the EU or Indo-Pacific or elsewhere. So that is something with the private sector and the academia is working together currently. But essentially to understand what is that we are faced with. Then the response options, again, there can be quite a number of those. Proactive communications, attribution, silence, if you don't want to add the oxygen to certain attacks, so you basically suppress without talking about them if they haven't spread. But also capacity building, crucially important, resilience, media literacy, and it's all enabled by cooperation with the like-minded actors, meaning either with organizations, international organizations, so the EU colleagues, the countries, the private sector, key opinion formers, and so on and so forth, so civil society. And through that, we think that we have a pretty good understanding of what is happening with certain hostile information attacks. Obviously, situational awareness is crucial in terms of understanding whether the kinetic element and the hybrid element is being faced together. Usually that comes with the cyber cyber-enabled attacks. So in that respect, I think the response is also what we heard from the EC colleagues from Commissioner Jourová, and also what UK has done with its online harms bill, with Australia's legislation. Last week I was in Dublin, Ireland, with their attempt. There's a general understanding that the governments are part of the response in terms of setting the framework of regulation. Again, it has to respond to particular circumstances. Free media, freedom of expression, free enterprise is all part of the answer, but it will flourish if the security and peace is there, and this is where NATO comes in. We are a peace alliance for our societies, for our businesses, for our 1 billion citizens, because when you have security, the prosperity can be built on top of that. Without security, it's very, very difficult to build prosperity or freedom in our countries.
Herming, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, coming from Taiwan.
Yeah, okay, so in Taiwan, as a democracy country, we believe that when we're facing the disinformation or misinformation, that we need to have a cooperation between public sector and the private sector. So from here, for example, we have a fact-checking center, which is a non-governmental organization. They can check the disinformation by themselves. However, we do have support them. For instance, we have some technology in our administration to check the false information or ransomware from the social medias. So we open this service to the fact-checking organization, and also we open this service to the law enforcement. But in the meantime, we have tried to build up a capability that's both law enforcement and also the private sector. They won't able to see each other's content. And we also will make sure that our agency, our government will not know the content that law enforcement or private sector they try to look. So we believe there's from the collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, it can build up a more resilient country to face the disinformation.
I think these themes of understanding, engaging in cooperation, this idea of collaborative efforts to assess and counter a threat reminds me quite a bit of some of the work that's been done in cybersecurity over the years, particularly thinking around other types of threat actors, even not specific to disinformation. There's sort of an increasing overlap in those dynamics, hack and leak, ways in which these two spaces intersect. But I'd love to hear from Miho and Lara. Maybe Lara, we'll start with you about the ways that, as cybersecurity professionals, you've tended to think about this.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a parallel between cybersecurity more broadly and looking at protecting the integrity of the information environment. So essentially my career is just under 15 years long. I came to this just 15 years ago. And when we started looking at cybersecurity as a national consideration or a national security consideration, there was like a lot of opposition at that time. And then as we matured that conversation, and it was part of a national security conversation, we started to explore having these national multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approaches to building national cybersecurity. So I think, for me, I'm quite inspired at the moment in my career because I can see the lessons that I learned very early on and lifting those and applying them to the protection of the integrity of the information environment, because we really do need to help navigate the conversation between governments and the private sector. And we also need to be able to build credibility and accountability. So we need to generate this ecosystem of stakeholders that can work with government to build resilience in the information environment.
So I'm now working at a global critical infrastructure company. And as part of our responsibilities, we have to provide 24/7 services to our customers. But it also means that we have to protect our own IT systems and the database from various risks. So Baiba talked about not only cyber disinformation, but also kinetic attacks. So critical infrastructure companies protect ourselves from various risks, such as cyber attacks, of course, but also natural disasters, because Japan is so prone to different types of natural disasters, including typhoon and earthquakes, but also pandemic and those system breakdowns. So we have to have a good people, but we also have to make sure that we have a good training and educational and awareness raisings, and we have to do regular cyber war exercises. Why? Because we have to respond to every types of risks. And we should do it on our own to raise our resiliency and our security and cybersecurity. But we also have to be mindful about interdependency between different critical infrastructure sectors. So energy, electricity, transportations, telecommunication, or communications. So sometimes we have to do regular exercises between these different critical infrastructure services. But of course, it takes lots of resources. So how we can make sure to have a good balancing and prioritizing. So it also comes down to awareness raising and also public diplomacy. And at NTT Corporation, my company, so my manager, the global CISO, sits on the board. So he's in a good position to educate senior executives who are not necessarily tech savvy, but also to translate between the tech community and also business people to make sure that we can have a good balancing and prioritization.
How do you all think about the best practices for this private-public partnership creation? How do you think about also ensuring that there is free expression and feedback from the public as well, perhaps, in that process? Lara, maybe.
So we're currently working with the Australian government and working in the Pacific to help build capability in this space. And essentially our first intervention is to ensure that whatever national entity that has responsibility for this really understands the code of practice, understands how to be able to build resiliency according to international best practice and the right ethical considerations. Once that knowledge is embedded and we understand that it has been absorbed and the team is motivated to conduct this business according to the knowledge we've transferred, we move on to a second phase, which is more operational. At PGI, we use a build, operate, transfer model. And we spend a long time with them, tooling them up according to the maturity that they are at and helping them become independent so that we can transfer out. So essentially, that is our methodology. I've been leading the development of our approach at PGI. We refer to it internally as Disinformation. So once we have that first phase and we're tooling them up in the second phase, we start to build the ecosystem of stakeholders. And that would include, representatives from academia, representatives from media houses, the social media platforms, and civil society organizations. And for us, that is absolutely key because it holds the entity accountable. The entity builds credibility within the ecosystem, and together they are able to build scale to identify information operations and respond to them.
So the good news is that everybody these days are interested in cybersecurity and so passionate about the public-private partnerships. But the reality is everybody wants to receive information, but not necessarily wants to give back. Sure. So, I think that actually after the war in Ukraine started, the dynamics started to change. So in a way, so the private sector has always felt that, we are reporting so much about the incidents back to the government, but not necessarily getting back from the government insights. But now the government and industry trying to fill out under the different sources and the information to make sure that we have a comprehensive overview or understanding of the threat landscape. So I think now that it's not just a one-way street from the private sector to the public sector, but now that the government and the industry are trying to help each other to build more resilience in the critical infrastructure companies, but also to have a better understanding of the threat landscape.
We have we call them ISACs in the US, Information Sharing Advisory Councils, and so you have them individually per industry so that you can share threats, receive information to and from the government. They are very much so, as you note, that sort of bidirectional government industry space. Thinking about disinformation, particularly in its role targeting the public quite directly, which is a little bit different, I think, than cybersecurity, which tends to occasionally you have individuals, or ransomware, of course, can affect many, many different types of people, many different types of organizations. But when we get into the notion of disinformation, particularly the phenomenon of people masquerading as things they are not, or the sort of malign propaganda that you were referring to, Baiba. I'm curious how we think about the incorporation of civil society as active participants in this whole of society approach.
I think I will try to combine also the best example with the private sector response and the work with the civil society. One example that I would like to mention, I think, is the lessons learned after 2014, when let's say, the governments or the private sector or civil society or journalists were not ready that Russia was actually occupying part of Ukraine and invading Ukraine. So either the understanding, the visuals, the technical capacities were not there, the intel was not shared, not declassified, so there was sort of a lot of guessing what was actually happening, and I think something big happened at that time when intel services, governments, but also the private sector clearly saw that as an opportunity to learn from it. So what we saw last year, the declassification of intelligence as a proactive move to engage both our societies around the world, but also to deter Russia, to clearly show that we know what they are doing, was an important step. UK did that before with Skripal. In the same time, since 2014, there had been a large group of civil society activists, the so-called Bellingcats and other open source activists who were investing in using the most modern methods of uncovering what was happening. We saw the satellite images from Maxar coming out as we speak without the delay of 2014 of more than 24 hours. So, and the capacity was much better, the technical capacity to identify and understand. So this proactive sort of engagement with the publics and media and key opinion formers by explaining what was happening and the political choice that was made around that allowed for that very wide political response, that unity, global unity of condemnation of Russia, but also mobilization of our own societies, civil societies, private sector, and others in supporting Ukraine, mobilizing resources, the sort of ability to provide lethal, non-lethal aid to Ukraine, but also speaking to our own societies, because again, from there on, uncovering the way Russia had prepared that operation, which was a lot of investment in unconventional, including information operations and psychological operations in Ukraine. Very clearly, it was an integrated operation that involved preparation for kinetic attack, but intel operation in terms of placing their operatives, hiring the right people in the right places, the integration into civil society groups on the left and the right, criminal networks activated. It was a comprehensive operation with hostile intent. And that is an example where kinetic, non-kinetic comes together. So obviously, not everywhere it's going to be the same, but I think this method of operation, we have to clearly understand that these threats exist. And that there has to be a conscious response to that. And civil society played a very important role and is still playing a very important role in countering those threats, both in terms of understanding at the societal level, what they are seeing, what they are spreading, what works, what doesn't work. So I think of the response as a network response of our societies, where not everybody is doing the same thing, but at least everyone understands at the pyramid basis level that there are actors that are trying to influence us, both through the cyber or other means, and that the cyber hygiene, information hygiene, the basic sort of steps play an important role that then are integrated into a wider type of response at the private sector, governmental level. And international level. So this is where we are. We don't have to be the same, but that understanding that everybody plays a role in prevention and response is an important element.
Yeah, if I may, obviously you're a peacekeeping organization, but I think in terms of disinformation, we should also think about it a little bit more broadly and not just within a conflict environment. And really, the ultimate objective is to ensure that the integrity of the information environment is protected, because ultimately what we're all striving for is stability and open democracy. And without having the integrity of the information environment protected, then that is ultimately unachievable. So if we are to approach it perhaps in that manner, it might be a little bit less binary, I think, and perhaps more inclusive a conversation. Yeah.
One of the areas that we've been very interested in our work at Stanford, but as we think about countering disinformation, is moving beyond the problem of social media platforms or media, and actually thinking about ways in which who is the effective counter speaker in many of these communities when there is evidence that there is some sort of campaign, some sort of hostile effort by a foreign actor or other adversary. Who is the entity that is best positioned to speak? And interestingly, in the United States, I would argue that right now, the answer is very often not the government, because of very low degrees of trust in the government at the moment. And so this is an interesting, I think, an interesting moment, I think, for democracies to think about how to empower more of the grassroots, more of the civil society organizations to serve in that counter-speaking role. But one of the things that I have noticed with Taiwan in particular is the ways in which the government runs its own sort of kind of countering programs to kind of counterspeak, to put forth more accurate information, and the ways in which that is then the engagement with civil society seems quite strong there as well. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think about that counter-speaking partnership in Taiwan.
Okay, I think from the government perspective, there are a couple things which is very important, and I think that the government should try to do. So there are two aspects. The first one is plurality. For example, there are several tools in social media or metaverse, but we need to make sure that all of these social media or metaverse, they can have equally access, and the people can use in a different tool to securely connected to each other. That's the first one. And the second one is inclusion. We think that inclusion is very important because in a digital world, we don't want everybody to left behind. So, although the inclusive and plurality seems not so directly related to misinformation, but we think that this is something the public sector can do. We need to make sure that you keep the metaverse in the order that everybody can access the media equally. And using this mechanism, also there's one thing we can do is, for example, we take the suggestion from the government employee. They told us that many of the government agencies, they're using the shortened URL to broadcast their messaging. And those misinformation, they're also using the shortened URL. So one of our government employees proposed that our government should have our own version of the shortened URL. So we make it work in 2 weeks. And it's being applied during the pandemic since last October. So that's one of the things which is also very important. When you have any misinformation, the government should act quick and always provide the real version or the official version of the government immediately to try to reduce the effect of disinformation, but not by condemn them or blame them, but by using the right way and the right information to provide to the general public. But in the meantime, I think we try to keep the balance between, we try to keep an environment that all the social media, they have equally participated in the digital world. And when the government try to publish any information, we should always be thinking about everybody, those people using a different metaverse, they should have equally access to the information. I think that's probably what we can do right now.
Lara, I think one of the things that we had chatted about in the kind of pre-panel prep was this question of how do we establish facts without air quotes, right? In the present world without repression. And I'd love to hear, I thought that was an interesting kind of angle of questioning.
We were talking about how we don't really encourage fact-checking because we think it's too binary. And we at PGI try to think of, we think about 5-10 years down the line, so our interventions are very long-term. So we don't really encourage fact-checking, and we focus more on trying to understand the environment, understand what is manifesting in the environment, and then slowly start to build this ecosystem and counter-messaging if required. But essentially we look at content, we look at behavior, and we look at infrastructure. So we have this three-pronged approach.
Did you want to respond to that one? Or?
Interesting. I find this discussion fantastic, really. It's very good to hear. I think the objective actually is to arrive at the same, to have that resilience of society, to be able to function in this very challenging environment, while in the same time having the public and private sectors being able to identify systemic threats, if there are any, and the right responses to them. But for me also, the important part is really the call to the governments and the private sector and others to understand that we need to invest in that capability. We need to invest what we call at NATO strategic communications capability. In other places it's called differently, which is both in tech, in the relationships with the most advanced tech companies. In terms of, at NATO we have the principles of responsible use of AI, so we are early adopters of AI, and especially for the understand function of the information environment. But again, for us to also localize it for NATO's purposes, to understand whether that is the local threat developing somewhere and the best response is local, or whether that is wider effort to try to effect a systemic sort of precondition for a kinetic attack. So in that respect, I think the conscious investment by the governments and the private sector in that effort, and those ISAC sharing platforms, and the ability to share data among the organizations is crucial. And here the private sector and academics play an important role, both to guide us, because they are very often further advanced than the governments are, but especially the big tech companies play an important role. And this, please don't tweet, I will say something that really concerns us. We clearly know that the big platforms have a very clear understanding of the threat. The threat teams, intel teams we speak to, they know what is going on. There is no secret. But if we need to get to the action that they do something about it, and we have a number of allies that are in certain challenging regions in Western Balkans and elsewhere, who have no capability of their own to counter those systemic informational threats because they're just too small. And the big platforms don't take action. So they know the threat, they understand the threat, but when they get to the leadership, when they get to the management and the legal teams, the threat and intel teams don't get to incentivize action from the platforms. And this is where forward-leaning action actually of the big tech platforms working with those less capable governments, less capable public sectors is crucial. Because again, as in cyber, as in other sectors, we are as strong as the weakest link. And if we are not able to incentivize big tech platforms to give back through that, to counter that threat, it's going to be much more difficult for all of us.
I want to go to questions in just a few minutes, but we'd sort of one final area that we had talked a little bit about, which is beyond the protection of free expression, how do we think about the protection of innovation itself? And so, Miho, maybe this is one for you. How do we establish these partnerships or protect facts or these other things that we've talked about in this panel without governments stifling the diversity and debate that platforms, that social media and other technologies give us, or as we move into a realm of increasing availability of AI, democratization of AI? How do we think about protecting that very innovative, expressive potential, and thinking about the role of fostering innovation while countering disinformation?
So as Lara pointed out, nobody wants to see that in a more divided society. And building upon what Herming and Baiba said, I think that one of the most important things is how to be inclusive, but also to make sure to have an open and innovative society. And I think that to make sure to have a good resiliency against misinformation and disinformation is to have freedom of speech, but also to make sure the continuations of communications. Because unless you have diversified information sources, how can you compare and also develop capabilities to be critical about certain ideas or thinking? But to do that, you have to have the government to be open to different technologies and ideas. And also the industry and the civil societies have to be diversified and provide different ideas and platforms. And I am so glad that these ASPIs, Sydney dialogues, are bringing together from different voices, but also from like-minded countries, because we are here to fight against misinformation and disinformation, but we are also here to be one team, to be more resilient, and also to be a secure and a better world.
I think we're going to open the floor to questions, I believe.
Hi. My name's Melissa Deswart. I'm from Flinders University, and I'd be really interested to hear perhaps some different reflections on the issue that we have that is common, I think, to Canada and the US, which is a movement like sovereign citizens or people who don't even identify as such. So you have a group of what would fall, I think, into what you've identified as, say, misinformation, but it has the capacity to be weaponised to become disinformation. And this question about how do you counter groups that are disaffected with government, can't be countered with any kind of fact-checking. In fact, the more facts and truth you throw at them, the more disaffected that they become. So we have a kind of asymmetry where, these sort of beliefs can be mobilised through online networks, but in fact a lot of what's happening plays out in offline networks, and they are becoming, I think, an increasing threat to national security. So I'd be really interested to hear any reflections from different cultural contexts about how perhaps we can counter these sort of online, offline disinformation groups that can cause a lot of social upheaval. Thanks.
Okay. So let me answer this from the government side. I want to take an example. For example, that's when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. There's been an attack from DDoS attack to government website. But in the meantime, they also put the hateful message in the train station and also in the convenience store. Then our agency, our ministry, we announced a new regulation, but we have a debate. The debate is for the train station, it belongs to the government. So any message board on the train station, we can regulate it and enhance their cybersecurity level. But the problem is in the convenience store, it's become a private sector part. Then when we discuss that, we need to be very carefully, because if we overpower the, we cross the border and we overpower the government's authoritarian, then we become a digital authoritarian, and then we become the same as our enemy. So that's why when every time we talk about that, we also talking about we need to be very careful about what the government side can do. And we also, for example, I mentioned that we can develop a tool for the false message, misinformation, or disinformation. But when utilize these tools, we should authorize them into the law enforcement or the NGOs. So I think the public sector and the private sector work together is very important, and also the emphasizing the critical thinking to the general public or citizen is also very important. But in the democracy society, there is a border that we need to be very carefully. And I am glad that my government have kept that border to distinguish us from our enemy.
So I think from the lessons learned we did during COVID at NATO, and also what we have seen in a number of other cases, the best response is as local as possible. So it's not a response for NATO, that's for sure. Local response. And that is enabled, just as the minister said, actually by comprehensive media literacy programs. I would give you a Finnish example, the new member state of NATO since yesterday. We are 31 countries now in our peace alliance. And in the Finnish system, you have basic media literacy course from the first grade in school. So they do that as part of the skilling of the population. And that leads, yes, there can be misinformation spread, or there are actors, they will always try. So the important part is to have individuals who are able to understand whether this is something that is just a click, or whether that is something that is an influence or wider, but also then either law enforcement or local governments or other actors on the ground who are trusted, actually, if it's spreading wider, either through the dark channels that are not very visible, or through social media. If it spreads and if it becomes more systemic, that actually there is an action taken then by a certain institution, depending what that is. But again, that wouldn't be something for NATO to do. We look at really more systemic threats that are there, as I said.
Hi, Alan Duffy from Swinburne University. It was actually a question about media literacy, and it was fantastic to hear about the Finnish example. I wanted to really get a sense from you all about how can we provide that kind of critical thinking, and Mihoko began to speak about that with diversified information sources, but the ability for educating youth, but of course also adults, and in how to be more capable critical thinkers, more sophisticated in the way they consume media, particularly social media. We've got to fix this problem now. We can't just wait for grade ones to grow up, although I wish we started that in Australia, quite frankly. And just, it's never too late, but it feels like it's getting pretty urgent now for this kind of capability in the public.
I think they should educate us. I think there's so much we don't know. That the way they work, the way they communicate among each other, it's a two-way process. Huh? It's not just us one way going and educating someone and saying we are the ones who are the ones who know how it should be done. So it's that network, when we think of our societies, the democratic societies, unlike 20 years ago where there was one main channel of information, public broadcaster, everybody was sitting around the same news and using the same types of conversations afterwards. Today, it's like a blockchain society. Many nodes emitting information, taking information, so that network of credible sources, that network of understanding at various levels is just crucial. There is nothing else. But again, I will go back to my mission, which is NATO. we also have to clearly understand at the macro level that information is an instrument of power, right? So for NATO, it's civil military. It's both to enable that big deterrence of our democratic societies, of our countries, against all threats that we might face. We are a defensive alliance, so that is something that is a mission. But instrument is an essential element. When we say we deter, it doesn't just mean that we have, able units, troops in the right places. It also means we tell stories that we do have those, that adversaries clearly know that we have both intent and ability to deter and defend. So putting it in a different context, for governments also, it's very important to project that ability to the criminal networks or cyber attackers and all the others. And that's what we heard yesterday from the Australian Cyber Minister, Home Affairs Minister, that they have clearly signaled that ability for hackers that you're going to get action from us if you do that again. So there's at different levels, different responses. So the media literacy is that basis of pyramid to create the ability to have that societal network in our countries. That's my...
I guess Minister O'Neill's point, if that was the medical intervention, I'm looking for the vaccine for the public to be immunized and to be less susceptible. How do we do that? Do we teach it in schools? Do we get adults to go to TAFE, vocational education training? We do a grad cert too. And really tactically,
absolutely.
how do you actually get this over the line? Because it feels like we are not actually winning this battle.
Well, I think there has to be a motivation to educate the population at large and ensure that all strata of society are not susceptible to information operations of any kind. That needs to be motivated by a stakeholder. And maybe we didn't really talk about it, but essentially it is part of, it's sometimes a political tool not to drive that education and awareness. And possibly that is the giant elephant in the room. But if I had to go back to looking at national cybersecurity capability, and if we had comprehensive approaches in that space, we would look at having a strategy, a plan. How are we going to build this capability? But we'd also have considerations around education and general public awareness. We would look at what training capability and educational capability exists within a geography for cyber. We would look at the criminal justice system and how can it process digital evidence, electronic evidence in courts. Perhaps in this space, legislation might not be the way forward because it is so hard to legislate in this space across multiple jurisdictions. And then we would look at standards and making sure that essentially we are building capability across the world that is coherent and operates off the same code of practice and ethical considerations. But in terms of your vaccine question, I don't think there is one unless geographies are motivated to build that.
In the US, it's being done largely in civil society. I'm happy to follow up with you on that. There's an academic paper you might want to look at. I believe it was done by Jigsaw, Google Jigsaw, in conjunction with, I think, perhaps Bristol University in the UK. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. But it specifically looks at exposing people to a better understanding of certain types of rhetoric and tropes that are common in certain types of rhetorical styles that you often see in propaganda and disinformation campaigns, and thinking about, rather than fact-checking on a topical level, can you think one level higher on that front? So I would definitely suggest looking at that paper because it is very much this question. Coming out of the US, that is not a sort of thing that our government would ever regulate, and so it is entirely done bottom-up through civil society. I think we have one question. We've got like 50 seconds, so.
It's a quick question, so thank you for indulging me. What are your KPIs? How do you know that you're succeeding in your efforts? And I suppose it's a question particularly pitched at Lara. I was really interested in your comment about not encouraging fact-checking and wanting to embed these capabilities over 5 to 10 years. So how do you know it's working?
That's a very good question. In terms of, we have a lot of discussion about how do you evidence impacts of a capacity building intervention. And this is an ongoing international discussion that we're having amongst like-minded folk. I think in terms of understanding whether you're having an impact within the information and environment of geography is being able to baseline and being able to understand whether the noise that you have identified at the start of your intervention has decreased or increased. I think that is the most obvious and possibly not incredibly sophisticated at the moment, but we are definitely thinking about more sophisticated measurements around our capacity building interventions in this space. I think in cyber it's more mature.
I think so. I think we have, did you want to add something? We've just crossed into the negative 30
for
seconds.
For NATO, the main KPI and the measurement of success is another 74 years of peace and security in the Allied nations.
Well, there we have it. So since we're in negative time now, I want to thank the panelists for their excellent comments today, for shedding light on such a complex topic. Thanks so much.
Thank you.